The silence was wrong. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in a jungle naturally. The rustle of canopy, the chirp of a million insects. It was a manufactured silence, flat and heavy like a blanket soaked in kerosene. Sergeant Hayes, his face a roadmap of chronic exhaustion and jungle sores, pressed the cold stock of a CR-15 into his shoulder and listened. The crickets had stopped 2 hours ago. Every veteran knew what that meant. Crickets don't run from rain. They don't hide from wind. They only flee from slow, silent movement that disrupts the entire ecosystem of the forest floor. They knew they were being observed. Reaper 6, 5 men and a radio, were 3 clicks off the established line of contact, deep in enemy territory, nestled into a small, muddy perimeter they had spent 6 agonizing hours constructing. Hayes scanned the blackness. The ambient light filtering through the triple canopy was maybe 10% of what a star-filled night should offer, turning every vine and shadow into a potential threat. Private Jensen, the new replacement who still smelled faintly of stateside soap, was shaking silently 3 feet to Hayes' left, his breathing too quick, too shallow. Hayes had smelled fear 1,000 times. This was the raw, paralyzing kind that preceded flight or paralysis. Hayes whispered into the dense air, the humidity instantly muffling his words. "Jensen, depth check." "What's that reading?" Jensen didn't immediately respond, lost in the echoing void. Corporal Martinez, known as Switch because he could change the tone of the whole squad with a single well-timed cynical joke, was monitoring the radio net a few yards away, the green light of the receiver casting a pale, unnatural glow on his face. Switch gave a negative head shake. Nothing but static and the occasional distorted chatter of a distant fire mission. Hayes felt the pressure building behind his eyes. They had set up a classic 3-man ambush line, 2 Claymores flanking their center position, tripwires laced with fishing line and empty C-ration cans acting as primitive alarms. But alarms are useless if the enemy is already inside the house, sleeping in your bed, waiting for you to turn off the light. Hayes checked his watch. 2,347 hours. They still had 4 hours until the scheduled extraction window opened. 4 hours of watching the jungle breathe, 4 hours of listening to their own hearts hammer against their ribs. The jungle smelled like rot, stale water, and the metallic tang of dried blood from a small scratch dock Riley had patched up earlier that day. It was the smell of war, quiet and pervasive. The smell that clung to your clothes and got washed out in the rain, only to be replaced by the odor of the humid earth. Hayes adjusted his position, feeling the chill of the wet ground seeping through his jungle fatigues, knowing that the enemy wasn't going to use a massive wave attack. They were going to use pressure, silence, and the paranoia they had expertly cultivated over the last hour. He thought about his wife back in Tacoma, wondering if she remembered the smell of fresh laundry. That thought, the simple, unattainable scent of civilian life, was almost enough to break him. But he suppressed it, focusing instead on the unnatural silence that now reigned supreme over the dark, suffocating expanse of the A Shao Valley. They were hunted, and the hunt had begun the moment the crickets died. The mission profile had been deceptively simple. Locate and confirm a suspected NVA resupply depot rumored to be fueling operations near Hugh. Reaper 6, operating with only 5 men instead of the standard 6, due to a persistent flu bug sweeping through the brigade, had inserted 5 days prior, deep enough that their comms were strictly limited to bursts and prearranged check-ins. The density of the jungle here was biblical. The foliage was so thick that the ground rarely dried, leading to perpetually slick mud and swarms of leeches that defied mosquito repellent. Hayes reviewed the setup in his mind one last time. The perimeter was small, maybe 20 feet in diameter, centered on a massive, gnarled banyan tree that offered marginal overhead protection from snipers or high-angle mortar fire. A necessity, but one that created blind spots. Hayes had placed Jensen on the southeast flank, the direction they had detected soft boot prints earlier in the day. Doc Riley, the medic, was positioned next to the small cache of water and morphine, his hands perpetually stained with mud and whatever disinfectant they had left. And Switch was the operational center, the umbilical cord to the outside world. The psychological waiting was the real killer. It wore down the edges of sanity faster than any firefight. Every shadow shifted. Every drop of water falling from the canopy sounded like a boot stepping on a loose stone. Doc Riley, who had seen 3 tours and carried the weight of 1,000 battlefield triage decisions, slid silently over to Hayes. His eyes, though tired, were clear. "Still nothing, Sergeant," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the dull hum of the radio static. "Worse than nothing, document. The air is dead. They're here. They're inside the wire, even if we haven't laid any wire yet," Hayes murmured back, referring to the invisible boundary of psychological security they had mentally constructed. "You think they know exactly where we are, or are they sweeping?" Riley asked, checking the safety on his own M16. Hayes shook his head. "They're not sweeping. If they were sweeping, we'd hear them. These are hardcore NVA regulars, maybe Sapper Company. They're tracking us. They've been on our 6 since we crossed the stream 3 days ago. We've been leaving sign, faint, but enough for them to follow. They're just waiting for the moment when we're most tired, most vulnerable." The realization was a cold knot in Hayes' stomach. They hadn't chosen this perimeter. The enemy had chosen it for them. The depot confirmation was critical. If they pulled out now, the intelligence would be worthless, potentially costing hundreds of lives in future operations. But staying meant a guaranteed fight, possibly their last. Hayes looked toward Jensen, who was now clutching his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white, his eyes darting frantically. Jensen was the weak point, the anchor that might drag them all down. Hayes needed him stable, needed him focused, but the jungle was pulling him apart thread by thread. Hayes quietly slid a fresh magazine into his rifle. The familiar metallic clicked the loudest sound in the universe, preparing for the inevitability that was now pressing in from all sides. The sound wasn't the metallic snap of a trip flare or the muffled cough of a suppressed weapon. It was the delicate, almost musical ping of a C-ration can rolling half an inch down a muddy slope, followed immediately by the faint, muffled thud of a body hitting the soft earth, trying desperately to minimize the impact. The sound came from Jensen's sector, directly southeast, perhaps 15 feet beyond a perimeter line. It was too controlled to be an animal, too slow to be a clumsy mistake. It was a conscious human attempting concealment that had failed by fractions of a second. Hayes stiffened, his blood turning to ice water. He didn't move a muscle, didn't breathe. Every pair of ears in the perimeter was focused on that sound, praying they had misinterpreted it. Jensen, however, had broken. A low, whimpering noise escaped his lips, sounding like a trapped animal. "Sarge, I heard it. I heard it," Jensen rasped, his voice raw with terror. "Shut up, Jensen. Eyes on." Hayes hissed, his voice lethal, yet barely above a whisper. He shifted his aim towards the sound, waiting for confirmation. Hayes knew he had a choice. Fire now, blindly into the bushes, which would confirm their location and likely draw immediate counterfire and mortars, or wait for positive identification. Risking a close-quarters engagement they were ill-equipped to handle. The weight of command settled on him like a crushing stone. He decided to wait. He needed to know the enemy's strength. If it was just 1 or 2 scouts, they could eliminate them quietly and fade into the night. But the instinctual fear radiating from the dead silence suggested something larger. Then, they heard the rustle. Not the natural rustle of leaves, but the distinct, abrasive sound of heavy nylon pack straps rubbing against woven jungle cotton. The material of an NVA uniform. It was moving slowly, deliberately, cutting obliquely across the front of Jensen's position, moving towards the banyan tree center. This meant the scout was trying to flank them, or worse, confirm the layout for a team about to rush the center. Switch, calm, and focused despite the impending doom. Keyed his mic on the silent burst mode, his finger hovering over the transmission button, ready to send the emergency extraction code if they survived the next 60 seconds. Hayes lowered his rifle slightly, allowing his eyes to adjust further to the deep dark. He raised his hand, a universal signal. "Wait for my fire dash." The scout moved closer, close enough that Hayes could smell the unfamiliar, slightly sweet scent of their tobacco and the damp earth clinging to their uniform. The scout paused directly opposite Jensen, maybe 10 feet away, seemingly analyzing the perimeter. It was an agonizing, prolonged pause. Hayes felt the pressure building, knowing he had waited too long. He was about to give the order to open fire when the scout spoke, not in Vietnamese, but in clipped, slightly accented English, aimed directly at Jensen. "You are tired, GI. You should rest." The words were a psychological torpedo, shattering the last vestiges of Jensen's composure. Jensen didn't hesitate. He screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound of pure animal terror, and unloaded half a magazine in a frantic, uncontrolled burst towards the voice. The night instantly exploded. The jungle ceased to be a passive observer. It became a violent, howling entity. Jensen's uncontrolled burst of fire was the spark, but the resulting explosion was a calculated inferno. Before the echoes of his M16 could die, the world dissolved into the high, frantic chatter of AK-47s firing from 3 distinct points, ripping through the foliage and tearing into the perimeter's defenses. Hayes roared, "Claymore! Fire!" even as he dropped prone, the heavy rounds whipping over his head, sounding like angry hornets. Doc Riley, showing remarkable coolness, immediately detonated the 2 directional Claymores Hayes had positioned. KRA chunk, KRA chunk. The explosions weren't massive, but the 1,000 steel balls tore through the close-range ambush points, followed by screams that were quickly silenced by the continuous enemy fire. The initial assault was devastatingly effective. Switch, attempting to maintain comms and transmit the full emergency code, took a burst of rounds directly into his chest and shoulder before he could finish the transmission. He slumped over the radio, the critical handset falling into the mud, his blood quickly soaking the earth around the vital equipment. "Switch is down. Doc, get to switch," Hayes shouted, emptying his magazine into the nearest muzzle flash, laying down suppressing fire. He heard Doc Riley scramble towards the central position, dodging incoming tracers that looked like streams of malevolent red insects cutting through the darkness. The enemy fire didn't relent. The Claymores had taken out the point men, but the main element was already surging forward, using the immediate shock and confusion to advance. They were too close. Hayes could hear the distinct sound of enemy soldiers screaming war cries and crashing through the thick undergrowth, their shadows blurring into the dark. Jensen, having exhausted his initial burst, was now reloading frantically, his hands shaking so violently he fumbled the magazine, sending it splashing into a shallow puddle. "I can't load. Sarge, I can't load," he cried, his voice breaking. Hayes knew they were lost if Jensen went completely offline. He threw a fragmentation grenade towards Jensen's position, forcing the enemy to pull back slightly from that flank. The grenade detonated with a heavy, concussive thump dash, momentarily stunning both friend and foe. The perimeter had already shrunk by half. They were now back-to-back, using the banyan tree as their last bastion. Doc Riley was fighting desperately to secure Switch, whose breathing was shallow and erratic. He took 3. Massive blood loss. "The radio is dead. The antenna's shot," Riley yelled over the din of automatic fire. The critical element was gone. No escape call had reached command, meaning they were truly alone, deep in enemy territory, engaged in a battle they couldn't possibly win. Hayes saw a dark-shaped lunge out of the bushes towards Riley. It was a large NVA soldier, bayonet fixed. Hayes didn't hesitate. He fired 3 controlled rounds, sending the soldier tumbling into the mud. But the momentary distraction cost him. A wave of fire chewed up the ground directly in front of him, splintering the roots of the banyan tree and showering him with wet dirt and wood chips. The perimeter had collapsed into a brutal, confined killing zone, forcing them into a desperate final stand. The fighting devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters nightmare. The sheer overwhelming presence of the enemy meant there was no time to reload carefully, no time to aim, only react and suppress. Hayes grabbed the fallen M16 of the NVA soldier he had just shot, its barrel still hot, and emptied the remaining rounds into the charging shadows. Doc Riley, having administered a large dose of morphine to Switch and secured a makeshift pressure bandage on his shoulder, dropped his medical bag and picked up his own rifle, firing from a low crouch while shielding the RTO's still body. The NVA were using the dense smoke and the confusion caused by the initial assault to press their advantage, forcing Reaper 6 into the narrowest possible configuration around the banyan tree. Hayes saw movement on the far side, two shadows attempting to crawl under the low canopy of vines, intending to bypass the main line of fire. He switched to semi-automatic, taking precise shots that were met by sickening thuds, momentarily clearing that approach. But for every one they dropped, two more appeared. Jensen, finally snapping out of his paralyzing fear, was now firing like a machine, fueled by adrenaline and guilt, but his aim was erratic, wasting valuable ammunition. Hayes knew they couldn't hold this patch of earth for 10 more minutes, let alone 4 hours until dawn. They needed to break contact, disappear into the jungle, and try to make radio contact from a new location. But Switch, the RTO, and critical communications link, was lying motionless, severely wounded, too heavy for one man to carry easily through the thick jungle, and abandoning him meant sacrificing their best chance at rescue, even if the radio was currently useless. It was the defining, terrible choice of command. Does a leader sacrifice the critical path to survival, speed, mobility, and conserving strength to honor the sacred promise of leaving no man behind? If they dragged Switch, they would move at a snail's pace, guaranteeing the enemy would catch them within an hour and wipe them out completely. But if they left him, and he survived the initial withdrawal, he was doomed to fall into enemy hands, a fate worse than death. Hayes looked at Doc Riley, who was reloading and staring at him with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for the order. Riley understood the math. Switch was dead weight now, a casualty of the tactical situation. But his bond to Switch was bone deep. Hayes had to choose between the life of one man and the survival of the remaining three. How much weight does that single life hold against the lives of the others? When the perimeter collapses, where does the boundary of duty end and the primal urge for self-preservation begin? This wasn't a question confined to the history books or command briefings. It was a hot, terrifying reality playing out in the dark, demanding an immediate answer from the sergeant who felt the cold metal of his own rifle against his sweat-soaked cheek. It is this moment, the impossible choice between the mission and the soul, that defines the soldier. Hayes made his decision, shouting his next command over the roar of battle, choosing a path that would haunt the rest of his days, regardless of the outcome. We ask you, watching this footage of absolute collapse, in a scenario where all paths lead to certain death, except the one requiring the worst moral sacrifice, what choice would you make? Share your perspective in the comments below, because these are the echoes that never truly fade. Hayes didn't hesitate once the decision was made. Doc, stabilize Switch enough to move. Jensen, cover fire. We're breaking contact now. Head north 45 degrees. Focus fire on the east flank, suppress. The order was shouted, raw, and absolute. It wasn't the decision to abandon Switch that Hayes made. It was the decision to drag him, prioritizing the moral covenant of the squad over the tactical probability of escape. The four men were operating on pure, desperate muscle memory. Doc Riley, understanding the impossibility of his task, managed to cinch a tourniquet high on Switch's arm and wrapped his chest wounds in tight, restrictive field dressings, essentially making him a package for transport. Hayes, meanwhile, grabbed Switch's harness and dragged the man's limp weight, pulling him sideways toward the thickest part of the northern jungle, where the foliage was so dense it offered a screen, albeit a temporary one. Jensen, functioning on blind rage and the need for redemption after his earlier failure, unleashed a continuous stream of fire, forcing the NVA to momentarily pull back, allowing Hayes and Riley the precious 10 seconds they needed to breach the perimeter. Move! 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 Hayes yelled, his breath catching in ragged gasps as he pulled Switch's body over a slick log, the RTO's helmet scraping against the wood. The withdrawal was not orderly. It was a desperate scramble into the blackest, most unforgiving terrain they could find. They abandoned anything non-essential. The rest of their C-rations expended magazines and Jensen's heavy field pack. Only weapons, water, and essential medical supplies remained. They plunged into a dense section of thorn bushes and rattan vines, the thick, thorny vegetation tearing at their clothes and skin, but offering crucial concealment. Hayes knew the NVA would immediately follow, their tracking skills legendary, but the initial noise of the fight would give them a few minutes of chaos advantage. The sound of pursuit began almost instantly, shouts in guttural Vietnamese, the clicking of AK actions being cycled, and the heavy crash of bodies moving quickly through the underbrush. They were still too close. They ran, or rather, struggled, for 5 continuous minutes, the weight of Switch feeling exponentially heavier with every yard gained. Doc Riley, despite his exhaustion, managed to secure a field sling, distributing some of Switch's weight onto his own shoulder, allowing Hayes to move with more purpose. The jungle floor was rapidly descending into a flooded depression, a massive bowl of fetid water and soft, sucking mud that promised to slow them down to a crawl. Hayes gritted his teeth. This was the trap. The NVA had channeled them into the swamp, knowing the terrain would kill their speed. But it was too late to change course. The sounds of the pursuit were closing in rapidly from behind, forcing them deeper into the muddy hell. The bog was a soul-crushing obstacle. Every step was a Herculean effort, pulling their boots from the slick, sucking mud, often leaving behind a boot or losing their footing completely. The water was shallow, rarely more than knee-deep, but the sludge beneath was thick and tenacious, smelling powerfully of decay and methane gas. Switch's weight became a physical impediment that threatened to snap Hayes' shoulders and back. Doc Riley, ever pragmatic, kept muttering encouragement, checking Switch's pulse every 30 seconds. Still weak, Sarge, but steady. We just need to keep moving before the shock sets him fully. Jensen, surprisingly, found his stride in the panic. He had become the rear guard, moving backwards, his rifle constantly swinging between the dense thicket they had just emerged from. His fear hadn't vanished, but it had calcified into a rigid determination to protect the men who hadn't left him behind when he broke. They heard the distinctive sounds of the Tiger Men, the NVA trackers. They weren't crashing through the jungle anymore. They were moving with methodical silence, using the heavy pursuit sounds of the main group as a screen. Hayes identified the high-pitched, almost bird-like calls that served as communication signals, echoing across the swamp. They were flanking them, attempting to cut off their escape route ahead. Hayes knew he had to change the game. He pointed towards a rise of drier land on their right flank, a small, barely perceptible ridge that jutted out of the swamp like a whale spine. Ridge. We move fast, we try to cross the ridge and circle back south. Throw them off the scent, he hissed. The ascent was brutal. The ridge was slick clay, and the exertion of pulling Switch's dead weight uphill while fighting the suction of the mud was nearly overwhelming. As they scrambled up the final incline, Jensen let out a muffled curse. Leeches, Sarge, everywhere. They were infested. Hundreds of fat, bloated leeches clung to their legs, arms, and necks, thriving in the swampy conditions. There was no time to remove them. They had to keep moving, the sight of their own blood mixing with the mud becoming just another sickening detail of the retreat. They reached the top of the ridge, providing a few moments of solid footing and a better field of fire. But Hayes knew the momentary respite was fleeting. The NVA were closing in, moving faster and more cohesively now that the initial chaos had subsided. Hayes looked back, catching a glimpse of a dark figure through the trees, not 20 yards away, moving stealthily, tracking their precise path through the torn vines and blood trails. They had less than 5 minutes before they were re-engaged. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, covered in leeches and the blood of their friend, and trapped between the relentless pursuit and the endless, uncaring jungle. Hayes slid Switch behind the thickest root he could find and ripped off his own shirt, soaked and clinging, to use as cleaning rag for the mud-clogged mechanisms of his rifle. This was it. The time to run was over. The time for fighting had arrived. The ridge provided a marginal advantage, rising about 30 feet above the swamp, offering a natural parapet and a slight downhill slope for their fields of fire. Hayes positioned the three remaining operational men, Doc Riley, Jensen, and himself, in a shallow line of defense. Switch lay motionless behind the central route, his life ebbing away despite Riley's best efforts. They counted their remaining assets: 2 full magazines for Hayes' R-15, 3 for Riley's M-16, and Jensen, surprisingly, still had 4, having reloaded successfully during the scramble. Total rounds, maybe 200. They had 2 fragmentation grenades and 2 smoke grenades, one of which was vital for marking their position if a miracle extraction materialized. Conserve fire, Hayes instructed, his voice low and grating. 3-round bursts only. Aim for center mass. Let them get close. We don't have the luxury of suppressing fire anymore. Doc Riley, his face streaked with mud and blood, nodded grimly. He had swapped his medic role for that of a rifleman. His eyes hard and focused, the philosophical doctor replaced by the grim reaper of necessity. Jensen was strangely calm now. The fear had been metabolized into pure, kinetic energy. He was checking his rifle, meticulously removing a clump of mud from his muzzle flash suppressor. The wait was agonizingly short. The first contact came not from the front, but from the left flank, where the ridge met the dense foliage. A rapid, low burst of AK fire tore through the bushes, hitting the thick trunk of a small tree barely 3 feet from Hayes' head. He immediately returned fire, 3 sharp, controlled bursts, aiming at the flashes. A strangled cry confirmed a hit, but this was only a probe. The NVA were testing their strength and location, trying to draw out their remaining fire and pinpoint the exact position of the few remaining survivors. Hayes knew they couldn't afford to be pinned down. He reached for a fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it high over the ridge crest, aiming for a small cluster of dark bamboo where he suspected the main NVA force was consolidating. The grenade explosion was sharp and metallic, followed by shouts of pain and confusion. This temporary disruption bought them maybe 90 seconds, but it also confirmed their exact location to the broader pursuit team. They were committed now. Hayes watched the shadows thicken and move with renewed aggression. He could hear their orders being barked. They were preparing to rush the knoll. He had one critical hope left. He had quietly activated Switch's remaining transmitter on the emergency frequency before the retreat, hoping the proximity of the initial fight was enough to transmit a single garbled beacon. If that beacon had somehow been picked up by orbiting command and they had managed to triangulate the area, a rescue bird might be on the way. But hope was cheap in Vietnam. Survival was earned in blood. Hayes checked the smoke grenade tied to his web gear. It was the last token, the ultimate gamble. He told himself that if he heard the distant thwomp 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 of rotors, he would immediately light the smoke, regardless of the consequences. But the only sound was the growing snarl of the approaching enemy, the hiss of the jungle, and the rhythmic, labored breathing of his 2 remaining squad mates. The final assault hit them with the full force of a tsunami crashing against a crumbling sandcastle. It was no longer probing fire. It was a sustained, coordinated rush from multiple directions. Hayes had miscalculated. The grenade had not deterred them. It had infuriated them. The NVA surged up the ridge line, screaming and firing, their silhouettes momentarily visible against the dark canopy. Hayes and Riley fired simultaneously, their rifles hammering out 3-round bursts that cut down the leading elements. The close proximity meant the NVA were practically on top of them before they could react. A large NVA soldier, driven by pure momentum, vaulted over a fallen log directly into their defensive line. Hayes immediately transitioned to his sidearm, the .45 caliber pistol thundering in the small space, the massive rounds hitting the soldier in the chest and knocking him backward into the scrambling shadows. Doc Riley was engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, with another soldier who had managed to get within bayonet range. Riley dropped his rifle, pulling his survival knife, the blade flashing in a momentary glimpse of moonlight as he parried the bayonet thrust. The sickening sound of steel meeting flesh followed, Riley winning the lethal exchange, but his breathing was now ragged, indicating a potential injury. Jensen was performing admirably, his fire controlled and deadly, protecting the right flank that was under intense pressure. But they were losing ground. The sheer number of attackers meant they could not suppress every threat. Hayes realized they had been fighting for what felt like an eternity, but it had only been perhaps 8 minutes since the perimeter collapsed. 8 minutes of pure, condensed hell. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his left shoulder. A round had clipped him, shattering the silence and the pain barrier. He ignored it, the pain instantly replaced by the metallic taste of adrenaline. He desperately reached for his last fragmentation grenade, intending to use it as a last-ditch barrier against the surging enemy on the right flank. He pulled the pin, but before he could release the spoon, a sudden, unfamiliar sound cut through the roar of battle. It wasn't the NVA, it was a distant, heavy thwomp thwomp thwomp, the unmistakable sound of American rotary wings, low and fast, approaching through the valley fog. The emergency beacon had worked. It was the sound of a heavy extraction bird, likely a pave low, coming in dangerously low for an emergency hot extraction. Smoke! Smoke! Now! Hayes screamed, fumbling for the red smoke canister with his good right hand. The NVA, hearing the approaching rotors, reacted instantly, redoubling their fire, knowing they had mere seconds to eliminate the threat before air power intervened. They concentrated all their remaining firepower on the small knoll, trying to cut down the 3 surviving soldiers before the cavalry arrived. It was a desperate race against the clock, the volume of fire reaching a deafening, climactic crescendo. Hayes ripped the ring off the smoke grenade and tossed it toward the apex of the knoll. A thick plume of brilliant red smoke instantly erupted, fighting the moisture in the air, a visible, screaming declaration of their position. The pave low, responding to the visual marker, banked sharply, its powerful engines roaring, the sound of the rotors now dominating all other noises. But the smoke was a double-edged sword. While it marked them for rescue, it also gave the NVA a perfect targeting solution. The enemy fire became impossibly heavy, concentrated precisely on the crimson cloud. Rounds chewed up the earth around them, kicking dirt and pulverized rock into their faces. Hayes watched in grim fascination as the pave low, flying incredibly low through the valley, began its gun run. The sound of the minigun was like fabric tearing, a continuous, terrifying shriek of fire raining down on the surrounding enemy positions. The volume of the NVA fire immediately dipped as they were forced to take cover from the overwhelming aerial assault. This was their window. Hayes grabbed Doc Riley by the collar. "Go, get Switch." Riley, already wounded but moving on sheer nerve, managed to pull Switch out from behind the root. Jensen covered them, emptying the last of his 4th magazine into the jungle line, buying them the final moments of grace. The extraction crew had dropped a Stokes litter, swinging precariously low on the cable, visible now through the smoke and the rotor wash. Hayes knew they couldn't all fit on the litter immediately, especially with a critically wounded man. "Riley, you and Switch first." "Go," Hayes ordered, his voice raw. Riley didn't argue. He expertly secured Switch into the litter, clipping the cable carabiner onto the harness. He gave Hayes a look of profound understanding, an acknowledgement of the sacrifice required. The litter lifted, ascending rapidly into the night sky, pulled upwards by the winch. Hayes grabbed Jensen, who was now weeping silent tears of exhaustion and relief, pulling him toward the open clearing created by the rotor wash. "My turn to cover, son. Run." Hayes pushed Jensen toward the cable, dangling wildly in the wind. Jensen scrambled to grab the harness as the pave low hovered violently, fighting the updraft and incoming fire, which had now renewed with fervor as the NVA realized the extraction was underway. The gunner on the pave low laid down continuous fire, suppressing the immediate threats. Jensen secured himself just as a heavy burst of fire slammed into the ground where they had just been standing. Hayes felt the terrifying finality of the situation. He was the last man on the ground, surrounded by a swirling mix of red smoke, spent brass, and a relentless, screaming enemy. He fired his last remaining rounds, emptying his 2 final magazines in short, vicious bursts toward the thickest enemy concentration, covering Jensen's ascent. Then, his rifle clicked empty. He tossed the dead weapon aside, pulled his last functioning sidearm, and watched as the second litter harness descended, swinging violently like a pendulum above his head, the promise of salvation within reach, but surrounded by the darkness that sought to swallow him whole.